Defenders of the Wild is here. I've had a chance to jump into it quite a bit. I've played it solo, I've played it co-op, I've won, I've lost, I've laughed, I've cried, and now I'm going to tell you about it. And going into this game, I had a bunch of questions. First and foremost, what is this game? I actually kind of FOMO knee-jerk backed this game. I really didn't know what it was. I heard Root, I heard Spirit Island, and I saw cute woodland creatures, and I just, I just bought it. I've also enjoyed Henry Audubon's designs in the past, specifically Parks. I just did a little mini review on Parks. So I had some faith in the designer as well. So there was a little bit more I was going on than just looks and a couple of broad comparisons. But I then wondered, is this anything like Spirit Island? Is this anything like Root? Is this even for me? And I'm going to answer all of those questions for you right now. Additionally, I'm also going to answer the most important question, which is, who is this game actually for? First, I'm going to state the obvious on what this thing is. You are playing one of 4 woodland factions, trying to defeat this mechanical invading force that's trying to build factories throughout the woodland, and in turn is spreading pollution and creating toxic sites, also creating other mechs called hunters that want to hunt you down throughout the woodland. You're trying to kick them out of your home. Fundamentally, how you do that, first and foremost, is gaining support. You gain support every time you do some of these actions, and those include breaching walls. The mechs are building these walls. You can't go through them, so each time you breach them, you get support. Defeating some of these mechs that are slinking around your woodland. If you defeat them, you gain support. If you clear any pollution or toxic sites, you also gain support. All of those things equal going up the support track, and once you are butted up against a camp, you can then use a build action to build camp, which is one of the conditions to win this game. Each player has to build all of their camps. Secondarily, you have to have all of their factories rewilded. What that essentially means is you have to breach a wall, get into the factory, defeat and clear anything that's on that factory in terms of the mechs and the pollution, and use an action to flip that hex. Once that hex is flipped, it becomes a wild territory, one in which you can build your camps on. Side note, you can only build your camps on your type of woodland. So each faction has a terrain type that they're connected to. So if you want to build your camp, it has to be on your terrain type. The one exception is these rewilded factories. Once you've built all your camps and you've rewild the factories, easy, you've won the game, congratulations. So how do you do all of this? You do this with faction-specific decks. They are pre-constructed. Each faction has 2 separate organizers. Each organizer has a shared set of cards, but then also specific cards, which gives each faction a little bit of asymmetry. These cards are made up of 3 really important parts. The first and foremost, there is a terrain type on them. We'll get to how those interact a little bit later. There are action points. That's pretty simply the number of actions you can take when you play the card. And then there's a special ability, which gives each card or defender a little bit of spice. So as you play them, you get to do something special. It either takes effect immediately or it's an ongoing effect. Sometimes it affects everyone at the table. Sometimes it's just you. I had mentioned that these are factions working together begrudgingly. That's because they don't necessarily like each other, but they're coming together to form a bond to knock out all of these machines. And the way that's represented in the game is no talking or discussing what card you are about to select. You select them simultaneously, you reveal them simultaneously, and then you can talk a little bit about strategy. So what makes this card play interesting? There's a couple different factors that you're taking into account as you're selecting cards. First and foremost, the color on the card or the terrain match is important relative to movement, because if your defender's terrain matches terrain that you're going through, you can treat a group of terrain essentially as one hex, meaning you can move through that terrain freely without having to spend an action for each and every hex that you're moving through. The spice on the cards that I'd previously mentioned in these kind of reveal and ongoing powers are definitely considerations when choosing the card. And now each of these cards have action points, so obviously more is better, but more specifically, what are the needs of your teammates? Does somebody need to be healed? Do you need more draw power? Do you all need special items that give you extra actions or more powerful versions of an action that you already have? There's a lot of little considerations in looking through your hand. I wouldn't say there is a huge variety, but there certainly are considerations in choosing the card, right? Like you're thinking about, do I need to make a movement and does the color actually matter? Also, what special abilities are absolutely needed right now? Or how many actions do I actually need to take to accomplish what I need to accomplish? That's essentially the decision space that you're thinking about as you're playing each and every one of these cards. I'd mentioned the items. These cards award items, as well as if you stop at somebody's camp, you get a specific type of item. There's 4 items in the game. The only items that are available are the ones in which that are connected to your faction. So if you're only playing with 2 factions, only 2 types of these items are available. They do a few different things. The bread just gives you an extra action. You know, it's essentially a wild action for yourself that you can use at any time. Rockets allow you to take out these mechs without having to roll the attack die, and we'll get to that in a little bit. The potions allow you to get rid of pollution or also heal. Once again, you don't have to roll the attack die. And the maps allow you to take a free movement action, once again, not rolling that attack die. The items are awesome. It just doesn't always feel great that you don't have this full set of tools at your disposal in the form of all of these items in every game, unless of course you're playing at 4 players. I had mentioned these action points. These action points are connected to general actions. I'll list them right here. I won't go through all of them really specifically. They're all pretty self-explanatory, but all factions can do them at all times. It really doesn't matter. I mentioned this rolling of attack die relative to the items, and that is the next consideration. If you're in a hex with another mech and you take any action whatsoever, it can be any of the actions listed, you have to roll one of these attack die. They'll either do 0, 1, or 2 damage to you. If you are next to a sniper, see there's 2 snipers positioned in each and every factory, and if you're on any side of that hex and you take any sort of action whatsoever, you also roll the same die, but they only hit you on the 1 or the crosshair symbol. Thematically, that makes sense. They have a slightly harder time hitting you. This is a huge consideration because if you take 3 damage and have to take 1 more damage, another person at the table randomly draws a card in your hand. That card is then placed under death tokens. There are 4 death tokens. They're connected to all 4 different types of terrain. And if there's 2 defenders from the same exact terrain or faction that die, you lose the game completely. As you're trying to go into hexes and clear pollution, defeat multiple mechs, and you're having to roll this die each and every time, you're getting beat up pretty quickly, you're losing defenders, and depending on what you have left in your hand, it might influence whether you push your luck and try to defeat that last mech. So if you've already had a defender from the orange terrain that's died, and you have a bunch of orange cards in your hand, and you're going to make a risky move that's going to have you roll that die multiple times, there's a really good chance that you're actually going to lose the game. So you'll very often have to use a regroup action that sends you back to any one of your camps. It's kind of a teleport superpower, but it's a basic action. And then go heal yourself. That is assuming you don't have any potions to heal yourself or somebody else doesn't play a special card that allows them to heal you for everything. You have to get out of there. Otherwise, you'll very likely lose the game. This is a very real and very crunchy decision, one in which is the biggest point of friction in the game. So what stops you from going back and regrouping in your camp over and over again, just rehealing, rinse and repeat? It's because in between each player's turn, there's a machine's turn, and pretty simply you flip a card and resolve it. There's 4 different versions of the card. Really, they do 3 different things, and they are building walls. And once those walls fully encircle a hex, another card will build a factory. Another card will spread pollution from the factory chutes that are randomized, so they'll be shooting all over the place. And if a hex accumulates 3, it becomes toxic, and if another pollution were to go on there, it cascades to another hex. The other things that these cards will do are to send hunters out and pursue you if they're close enough. I had just mentioned how crunchy it is when you're trying to decide whether you're attacking mechs or regrouping. This idea of shooting those mechs out into the woodland and pursuing you, while in the base cards don't attack you, they still technically do the moment you do any sort of action whatsoever, so they will absolutely foil your plans. This system is governed by essentially a left-right toggle switch, and one of the cards toggles it back and forth and tells you which way to build the walls or where to throw those mechs out on the board. I will say this system conceptually is pretty simple. In my experience, I found a lot of little specific instances where maybe the engine runs out of room to build a wall, What do you do with it? It has to go back to a factory. Which factory does it go to? It goes to the highest numbered factory. Then it's redeployed based upon which side the toggle switch is at that particular time. But if there's something already there, there's a rule about where to redeploy it. It's sort of fiddly. And once you get it, it's fine, and you just kind of know what to do when you find an exception. But we found ourselves digging through the rule book quite a bit. I would have liked to have some sort of rules aid, but it's not a huge deal. Just know that it is a little fiddly, something you are managing throughout the game. So this leads me to how you lose. So if the machines have built all of their factories and they have to build one more, no matter if you've rewilded most of them, they just have to run out of factories to build. They win. If they've made 6 toxic sites, remember that's 3 pollution that accumulate on 1 space. If they do 6 of those, they win. The good news is you can clear those and it goes back on their board. There's a way to walk that back a little bit, unlike with the factories. And then of course, if 2 defenders from the same exact faction die, when we lose, the majority of the time we've lost through deaths. We've lost 1 time with the full factory build, and we've never lost with the pollution spreading into toxic sites. I will say the worst way to lose is with the death. It's sort of anticlimactic. I mean, you're sitting there and you're holding up a hand of cards and someone has to pick it. And, you know, maybe you have only yellow cards in your hand, and you know if they pull 1 yellow card, you're losing the game. It's not a feel-good loss. I think the most fun losses where we were fighting to the end and we knew we only had a couple turns for that factory to be built. Maybe we get to a point where the hex is fully built out and we know if that next card is drawn, they're going to build the factory, or at least try to build the factory, and we will lose. Maybe we know there's a couple cards left in the deck. There's a 50% chance that one of which are going to be drawn and lose that game. So we're feverishly trying to rewild or build that last camp to try to win the game ourselves. Those were the best endings for me. I will say when we've lost, we've only gotten 1 of those endings. So that's the most satisfying loss to me, at least. That in a nutshell is Defenders of the Wild. The next questions to me, and I think maybe you're asking if you're watching this video, is this at all like Spirit Island? So I think you could probably tell like this cascading failure of pollution to toxic sites feels a lot like blight being spread throughout the island. The hunters being spit out of the engines and the building of the factories definitely feels like this cascading failure of Spirit Island. You're fighting against the machines trying to rewild the factories, similar to trying to damage the cities and towns or whatever it might be from Spirit Island. So all of that feels a lot like Spirit Island. The machine deck as well kind of mirrors a little bit the event deck. I don't even know what it's called in Spirit Island, where you're essentially drawing cards that are connected to terrain types, and they're sitting on a timer, and you see that one will be ravaged or explored or whatever it might be at a different time. In Spirit Island, you see that coming. Here, it's a random draw. You kind of have an idea about the odds of the cards that are left in the deck that you're drawing from, because there are very few. But in those regards, I guess it's fairly similar to Spirit Island. So that's kind of where the similarities end with Spirit Island. Now I want to talk a little bit about its similarities with Root. The most obvious thing is its cute woodland creatures. The aesthetic very much looks to be inspired by Root. There is definitely a bullet point in asymmetric factions that should be noted as it relates to Root, but overall it has significantly less in common with Root. But I do want to dive into the asymmetry a little bit, because that's where the biggest disconnections from something like Spirit Island and Root might exist. So Spirit Island and Root have very heavy, deep metagames, meaning you can dig deeply into the spirits and the different factions between each game and fall into countless strategies and how they interact with each other, and how the spirits might synergize with each other, or how the factions in Root might interact with each other when you're trying to defeat. There is layers upon layers of depth in its asymmetry. Each spirit and each faction in both games very much have a different personality. They behave in very different ways. All of them have this feeling of progression. In Spirit Island, you have completely different boards from one spirit to the other. They need to be played completely differently. You're trying to get new cards that synergize with that particular spirit. The depths are absolutely endless. Root, very similarly, has completely different factions that do completely different things and need to be played in completely different manners. Defenders of the Wild is not that. It shares some simple DNA with both games, and I would say is probably a reduction of both games to a more simple version. The asymmetry that exists in Defenders of the Wild is very light. 90% of each faction does the exact same because you're using those action points in the same exact way. It's those special abilities on those cards that when you play them create the interest, right? Just like in Spirit Island and just like in Root, those asymmetric things that you can do different than everyone else are really what makes those games interesting and deep. And that does exist here just to a lesser extent. Now, if you are somebody that is a huge Spirit Island fan and or a huge Root fan, and you're hoping for this to continue that passion in a combination of the two, this is not that game whatsoever. This is a significantly more simple game that has a significantly more simple rule set. There's no extra things to learn about each and every faction you're playing. You can very much make the decisions based upon the cards that are in your hand. You're not worried about any sort of power progression in the particular faction or spirit. It's just an easy version, I would say, more so of Spirit Island with some aesthetics similar to Root. And is that a bad thing? No, I actually think comparing this game at all to something like Spirit Island or Root is not a fair thing to do whatsoever. I think especially drawing on Spirit Island as a reference is really helpful for me as a board game reviewer. But if I were to use that as a reference to rate it against, especially with where I am in my board game career, I would rate Spirit Island heads and shoulders above it. Spirit Island is so much more intriguing for me. It's a game that I continue to play solo to this day and will gladly dive deep into those spirits as I have time, but is significantly less accessible. And that's where this game comes in for me. The big question is this game for me? And it absolutely is, but I'm not pulling this game to play by myself. As much as it's fine solo, I'd much rather dig into the deep metagames of Spirit Island. However, this game is being asked for over and over again. In fact, as I record this, my son is waiting for me once again to play this game because he liked it so much. This is a game that if you are, number one, trying to get somebody up to something like Spirit Island, a really great precursor. If anyone asked me right now, like, how do I get my loved one to play Spirit Island? I would not say playing Spirit Island because it is completely overwhelming and really tough, especially if they don't have kind of prerequisite games that have got them to this point and they can just understand pretty complex systems. In this instance, this is the conduit. This is the thing in which they play and fall in love with and then maybe get bored of as they progress in their board game journey, and then finally make it to Spirit Island. But with all of that said, I do see this being some people's favorite game. If you bounced off of Spirit Island or even something like Root, just because you don't want to have to spend the brain power to dive into the different factions and the different spirits to understand those synergies, all of those things that I said in the past. But you like this idea of cascading failure, light asymmetry, working together, solving this puzzle, exploring these different factions as light as they might be. This might be the game for you. I think a ton of people have bounced off of a game like Spirit Island that might really enjoy this. So I would say if you hated Spirit Island, but you like the idea of trying to solve the cascading failure puzzle, this absolutely might be a wonderful game for you to try. I would also say if you absolutely love Spirit Island and or Root, but can't get it to the table, this is very much like me. I'm never going to get anyone in my household to play Spirit Island. Luckily, it's a great solo game. Root, I'm twisting some arms a little bit. We've had some breakthroughs at 2 players, but regardless, it's not particularly easy to table. This is a fairly quick setup. This is a pretty easy rule set, especially when you understand how the machines interact with the cards that are being drawn. And it's just accessible and is still a fun puzzle. It's just not the game that I'm going to dive deep into and fall into and never look back and become my favorite game. It's a tool in my belt and could be a staple in your belt depending on your situation. I have no idea about this game's availability at retail. I would say it's probably the cheapest Kickstarter that I have backed in a really long time. It was a breath of fresh air that there was no deluxe version, there was no extra back, there was no play mats, there was nothing. It's just this game. So I assume if you see this thing at retail, you're going to get the same exact game I played and backed. I love that. It's also an incredibly small box. So this thing just has accessibility, aesthetic, and just flat out fun written all over it. And that's it. That's Defenders of the Wild. If this has brought any value to you whatsoever, maybe thumb up, maybe subscribe, I don't know. Other than that, thank you very much for being here and have yourself a great week.